I'm on a mission like a couple spies, and that, guys, is the reason why I catechize. The good news.
Welcome to the Reformed Standard. I'm Tony. Let's get started. Question 30 of the Westminster Larger Catechism reads, Doth God leave all mankind to perish in the estate of sin and misery? Answer, God doth not leave all men to perish in the estate of sin and misery, into which they fell by the breach of the first covenant, commonly called the covenant of works. But his mere love and mercy delivereth his elect out of, and bringeth them into an estate of salvation by the second covenant, commonly called the covenant of grace. So there's some pretty significant theology that's being delivered here in this question. So one of the most contentious controversies in the Presbyterian world over the last probably 30 years or so has been a combination of what was called the Shepherd controversy, which happened before that, but then especially as of late, the federal vision controversy. And one of the issues in the federal vision controversy is a denial of this bi-covenantal structure of redemption. And so the federal vision controversy, to greater or lesser degree, depending on who is advocating it, wants to flatten out the distinction or the difference between these two covenants. And they claim they're making they're reframing the covenant of works to be part of the covenant of grace. But in reality, what they're actually doing is they're making the covenant of grace a covenant of works. But we'll get into more details with that as we get further on into what the covenant of works or what the covenant of grace is. So here what we're saying, though, is that God, because of his grace, did not leave all men to perish, but instead he elected some in eternity past, and then in time acted to bring about the salvation of those elect by entering into a second covenant. And so the language here is intentionally designed to follow after or to mirror the language that was used about entering into a covenant with Adam. And so here we recognize that this covenant was not brought about by some obligation. Sometimes you hear people who will say that God was obligated to provide some option of salvation for fallen mankind. And this question here denies that. And so it's again reaffirming, as we talked about in the previous questions and also in the brief excursus into the Scots Confession, that all men are in a state of sin and misery, and they fell into that estate by breaching the first covenant, which was the covenant of works. But then here, God freely, because of his love and because of his mercy, delivers those whom he chooses freely out of that estate. And here's where it gets to be really important, is that just as in the garden, Adam was not able to merit or obtain any sort of permanent eternal blessing or blessedness and fruition of his relationship with God apart from a covenant. And we talked about how God condescends to bring that covenant about. Likewise here, no creature after the fall, especially after the fall, is able to bring about any sort of fruition or any sort of redemption apart from covenant. And so God enters into this second covenant, which is called the covenant of grace. And this covenant is purposed to bring them into an estate of salvation by a redeemer. And we'll talk about the redeemer, obviously, as we get to that. But this is important because this establishes the way that reality functions in relation to God. So we saw that in the questions about the original creation of man and the special acts of providence towards them. But we see here that even though that first covenant failed because humans were not obedient to it, they were not faithful to it. We see here that this second covenant is purposed to bring them into an estate of salvation. And this is important because the purpose of the covenant is to bring them into an estate of salvation. And we see later that this covenant is actually fulfilled by God. So the distinction here and the reason that the first covenant can be called a covenant of works is not because of any sort of strict merit that would have obligated God to reward the creature. That sometimes is a bit of a straw man argument leveled against this. But instead, it's called a covenant of works because the condition of fulfillment of the covenant was the obedience of the creature. And Adam was required to fulfill the stipulations of that covenant himself. And we saw that he was given every ability, every reason to be able to do that, and he failed. But this second covenant, which is a covenant of grace, is not a covenant by which the creatures have to fulfill the stipulations. There are still stipulations, there are still conditions, but it's a covenant of grace because God has graciously acted to fulfill the stipulations himself. And so this first covenant is a covenant whereby favor is obtained by means of obedience to the covenant. And the favor is there, and the giving of the covenant was a gracious, or not a gracious, was a unmerited favor. And the covenant of grace is given not because of an unmerited favor, but a demerited favor. And that will become more and more important as we sort of unfold this theology through the rest of these questions here.
You know, if you want, you could know this. The Catechism, hey, the Catechism, hey. Do you know what the chief and the man is? And how the Father, Son, and Spirit do manage? Do you know if you want, you could know?
West Side.